Hi, good afternoon, everybody. If you're in Germany, good morning. If you're in the US, good day for whoever joins us from other countries. I'd suggest we wait for maybe 1 or 2 more minutes to see if other people are going to join us, because I can see that the number of participants is still going up. Okay, I would say that we can start. Welcome everybody to our panel called Better Be Prepared, the Ukraine Negotiations, Peace, Ceasefire or Escalation. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mareike Müller. I'm a foreign correspondent at German business daily Handelsblatt, and I cover Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe. I'm currently based in Riga, but I'm frequently traveling to Ukraine. I've worked in the past years in Russia, Moldova, Georgia, the Baltic states. I'm extremely happy that this topic is going to be covered in this new series by Atlantik-Brücke, which is, I think, also a great way to get people together to give you as listeners the opportunity to ask questions and to get in contact with the panelists. And I hope we'll have a wonderful session today. A quick note on the timing. We have an hour approximately, and we thought about dedicating the first 45 minutes roughly to questions and answers by the panel, and then we're opening up for questions from the audience. But if you have questions and you don't want to forget them, just drop them in the Q&A section of the Zoom chat. And I would say, let's get this started. I have the great honor to introduce a wonderful panel. So first of all, we have Melinda Herring. She's a senior advisor at Razom for Ukraine. Razom means together in Ukrainian, and she's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Hi, Melinda. Then we have Angela Stent. Angela is a senior advisor to the Center for Eurasia, Russia, and Eastern European Studies, and a professor emerita of government and foreign service at Georgetown University. She's also a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute. She served as a national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia, and I have lots of questions about that because it sounds extremely interesting. And she served as in the Office of Policy Planning in the US Department of State. And then last but not least, we have Tobias Lindner. He's a former state minister at the Federal Foreign Office. He's a member of the party Bündnis 90 Die Grünen, which is the Greens. A fun fact that I read about Tobias Lindner is that he refused military service, but later participated in civilian training courses of the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces. And I think that when we talk about transatlantic relations in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, conscription and the German army will certainly be a topic that interests many people. So welcome everybody on the panel. Very happy to have you all. Okay, I would actually like to start this talk with a quick reminder of what's happening in Ukraine. Maybe you've read the news this morning already. There has been a massive attack on Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities overnight and in the early morning. I spoke to a friend in Ukraine who's based in Kyiv this morning, and she was, just very tired, very stressed, and it was just a reminder of how easy it is to forget that this war is going on with such intensity, and actually maybe even increasing in intensity. And I'm very happy to ask the first question to Angela. I'm wondering, Angela, from your perspective, in this first month in office that Donald Trump has now served, he has introduced new dynamics to the whole Ukraine situation, and he has also shown to Ukrainians several times that his policy is much more volatile and, let's say, less reliable and less foreseeable than his predecessors. What do we actually know about the goals and ambitions of the people who negotiate on the side of the United States?
Well, thank you very much for that question, and thanks to the Atlantik-Brücke for inviting me to speak here. So we have to understand there are three sets of negotiations going on from the US side. And the most important one for Donald Trump, and I would say for Vladimir Putin, is the American president's desire to reset US-Russian relations in a way that they haven't been for a long time. He thinks that they're great business opportunities for US business in Russia. He wants to, if you like, invite Vladimir Putin back to the global board of directors to end the isolation of Russia. And those are the negotiations that are most important to him. And I would say, of course, those negotiations are also the most important to Vladimir Putin. So the people we have negotiating this, the most important one until now has been a longtime business associate and friend of Donald Trump's, Stephen Witkoff. He is a real estate promoter from New York. He has no diplomatic experience, and he's the one who has been sent to talk to Vladimir Putin on a number of different occasions. And when he has talked to Vladimir Putin, he has come back and essentially reiterated the Russian narrative about why the war broke out, about the fact that Russia was provoked into the war, quote unquote, and that he has been the chief negotiator. Now, from the Russian side, it's not only Vladimir Putin, but also Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, has been one of the people negotiating with Witkoff. He's also come to the United States because he is, again, pressing the idea that there are these great possibilities for better economic ties between the two countries. So that's the first set of negotiations. And I will say, having said that, we haven't heard very much from Mr. Witkoff in the last few weeks. It was much more prominent in the earlier months of the Trump administration. So the second set of negotiations from the US point of view are those that are supposed to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. And as you probably know, President Trump has reiterated that the war wouldn't have broken out had he been president, that he could end this war, first of all, in 24 hours and then in 100 days. And those negotiations have also been carried out by Mr. Witkoff. So he's kind of dual-hatted, restoring US-Russian relations and negotiations to end the war. The third set of negotiations are, of course, with Ukraine. And there you have a whole team headed by General Keith Kellogg, who was in a previous Trump administration and, of course, is a military man. And he has, I would say, a very competent, good team with him. But they are only talking to Ukraine because the Kremlin, right from the start, said that they wouldn't accept General Kellogg as a negotiator because he has rather strong views on Russia and has criticized Russia for what it's done. And so you have these separate teams. Now, in the beginning, President Trump said there has to be a ceasefire. He insisted on that. And of course, President Zelensky has agreed to that. And we know, of course, that there was this terrible meeting in the White House when President Zelensky was, in a sense, ambushed by President Trump and the vice president. Since then, President Zelensky's relationship with Trump appears to have improved somewhat. They met on the sidelines of the funeral for the Pope. But Trump, as you said, he changes his mind often. So just after the coalition of the willing, the German Chancellor, French President, British Prime Minister, and Polish Prime Minister visited Kiev a few weeks ago and came out with a statement saying, that there would be much tougher sanctions on Russia and taking a much tougher line on Russia. And President Trump initially agreed with them. That's when President Putin called this midnight press conference and said, no, we can begin negotiations. In other words, he wanted to head off any more sanctions on Russia. And the only reason, in my opinion, why President Putin has sent his negotiating team to negotiate with the Ukrainians is because he doesn't want the sanctions. He is not serious about ending the war. As you yourself said, Russia has increased its bombing of Ukraine.
I have a question about the current state of affairs in those talks. So in 2022, there have been early talks and they were very unsuccessful very early on. And now this year, for the first time since then, the Russian and the Ukrainian side came together officially to talk about a way that could lead, or to allegedly talk about a way that could lead towards the end of the war. Now then, a couple of weeks later, they had their second meeting. And right now, from what I understood, everything that has happened can be summarized in the Ukrainian side has issued a document with their ideas, and then the Russian side has issued a document with their ideas. They've exchanged those documents. But where are we now? And is actually the next step to be expected to happen within this format? Or do you think that more will happen behind closed doors in very different settings, maybe also involving more of the US or the Vatican, and maybe settings that we are not aware of?
Yeah. So the one thing that these two sets of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia have achieved is a humanitarian, the exchange of prisoners, and that's very good. You know, that should continue. And obviously, the Ukrainians are now also waiting for the Russians to start returning some of the children who were abducted from Ukraine and taken to Russia. It's not clear whether there will be another meeting in this format. The Russian team is the same team that negotiated with Ukraine in March and April of 2022. And we already heard Vladimir Medinsky, who's heading this, who's the culture minister, warn the Ukrainians and the outside world that, under Peter the Great, Russia and Sweden fought a war for 21 years. And as far as he's concerned, that could happen. What the Russians have issued to the Ukrainians is a maximalist demands, their so-called memorandum. They're the same demands that have been there since the beginning of the war. And that would essentially amount to Ukrainian capitulation. The Ukrainians had their own set of ideas, memoranda, and they've exchanged these. But we're really no further towards having a ceasefire, and the Russians have said that they won't have a ceasefire until, quote unquote, the root causes of this conflict have been resolved. And as far as we know, the root causes would mean going back to documents, proposed treaties that Russia sent to the United States and NATO in December of 2021, it would essentially mean rolling back NATO to where it was before the first enlargement, and essentially ceding to Russia a sphere of influence, not only over the post-Soviet countries, including Ukraine, obviously, but Eastern Europe too. So it appears as if the Trump administration is distancing itself from these negotiations, and they've already said, if they can't come to some agreement, there's a limit to what the US could do. So I don't know whether there'll be another session of these negotiations, but it's very hard to see how they're going to make any progress until the Russians are willing to make some compromises and move away from their maximalist positions. And I think we're going to come back to this later, but the only way to get the Russians to do that is to put much more pressure on them. And that involves not only sanctions, but from the US point of view, supplying Ukraine with more of the weapons it needs. Europe is already doing that. So I think until that happens, we're not going to see any more progress on the actual possibility of a ceasefire.
Thank you so much. Melinda, you're working in Ukraine very often. You have lots of Ukrainian colleagues. Could you tell us from your perspective what your colleagues' mood is like right now? What they tell you about their families, maybe what your friends in Ukraine are telling you about the situation, and how much hope there still is? Because I remember when Trump was elected, I was just in Ukraine, and it was a bit of a split image between, like, on the one side, people who were like very hopeful that this will change things for the better, and others who were very skeptical. How is that public opinion developing from your perspective?
Thanks for the chance to be here. And I had the same impression at the beginning of the new Trump administration. I couldn't believe it when I went to Kiev. People were very hopeful and optimistic that Donald Trump would be different than Joe Biden. And the view that I found, especially among the political elite, was that Joe Biden had been fine, but he didn't give Ukraine the weapons it needed to end the war. And there was this a narrative that maybe Donald Trump would be like the old Donald Trump who gave Ukraine the javelins when Obama wouldn't, and that he would embrace sort of a muscular Reagan appeal. Well, look, that hasn't happened, and I can't find that hope anywhere in Ukraine now. I just got back from Odessa and was in Kharkiv and Dnipro this year, and Kiev as well. So I think Ukrainians are realistic. In a word, Ukrainians are still utterly determined. Nothing has changed for them, even though the situation is more serious when it comes to drones and attacks at nights right now. The mood hasn't changed, and I don't expect it to. So I agree with Angela's analysis. I think she's laid it out very, very nice. But with Trump, he's a wily character. So one of our friends, Ambassador Kurt Volker, always says you have to consider that Trump is not ideological. He's not like a normal American president or German president. You never know what you're going to get from him, and in a sense, that's a good thing because he can swing very wildly. So yes, at this time, he's distanced himself from these discussions. I agree with Angela. We may not see any more negotiations because the document that the Russians put forward is absolutely terrible. It would force the Ukrainians to give away 4 of their oblasts and Crimea. It would mean accepting limits on the size of the army, which they view as their guarantee, as their future. You know, the faith is really in the army. And when you look at public opinion polling, that's the #1 trusted institution in Ukraine over and over again, consistent with the war. But on Trump, I think it's important to say a few things that maybe don't meet the eye in Germany. So he doesn't like war. He's not ideological. So it's possible that he could change. He could wake up and he could say, I've had enough of Trump. I've had enough of these strikes. He doesn't like Zelensky. Like, that's a very well-known fact. We saw that in the White House, and there's a personal animus there. Some psychologists have suggested that they're too much alike. I'm not going to go down that path. I think that's an interesting digression, but I'm not going to play amateur psychologist today. So the one area that I would say that's really interesting to me is that Donald Trump has learned about the abduction of Ukrainian children. Russia has kidnapped more than 20,000 Ukrainian children, and this is an issue he recently told the press, "Oh, I just learned about that." And he also doesn't like war. So this issue of the abduction of Ukrainian children is one that his base really cares about. So I expect to see him make more. He's not going to be able to ignore this issue. This is sort of a liability. And then I think more broadly, politically, he needs a foreign policy win. He doesn't have any foreign policy wins. The only thing he can point to so far is the minerals deal in Ukraine. So he's since said, I can't solve this war in 24 hours. He admits that. Look, I was speaking metaphorically, but I think he's starting to realize he can't ignore this for political reasons, and his base is going to want to see progress on the issue of the children.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, from what I understand, it seems to me like the Ukrainian administration now has, and especially in the beginning of Trump's second term, has put in a lot of energy and a lot of additional energy into trying to figure out those, I don't want to call it a mood swing, but like swings in what Trump and his administration say about Ukraine. And that cost them a lot of energy, right? Now, I'm wondering, do you think that Ukraine is now focusing mainly on keeping the US in the game, keeping their support, or do you think that they are simultaneously also trying to get whatever they can from Europe, and how do they balance at the moment diplomatically those two efforts?
So that is the big question. So at a minimum, I think that the Ukrainians want to ensure that the United States keeps giving its intelligence support, which is crucial. And there's no indication that the United States is going to turn that off. And they want to ensure that the weapons packages that President Biden put into place that will take a while to come online, that those continue. One of those key assistance packages was just diverted to the Middle East. And there's a lot of worry about that as well. But other than that one little incident, those weapons packages seem to be online. I think the Ukrainians would love to see our Congress pass additional sanctions. And there's a bill right now that's been introduced, and there's enough signatures. I've been on the Hill. I was on the Hill all last week. I visited a lot of Republican offices, and the attitude that I heard was, we're not moving this until President Trump gives us a green light. The Wall Street Journal just reported that the president's office, that Trump's office, is silently, very quietly trying to soften the language of this bill through some sort of mechanisms of language, and then also some carve-outs. So I wouldn't count on that. It's really up to the president and up to his sort of mercurial quality. One other thing I should point out is we've done some public opinion polling among MAGA Republicans, and 70% of MAGA Republicans say increase the support to Ukraine when they find out about the issue of the kidnapping of children. So that's one issue that does move his base. The other issue that moves President Trump's base, and we saw this last year when Ukraine had extreme shell hunger and Congress wouldn't put another package before it, another assistance package. The issue that moved Speaker Mike Johnson, and ultimately he was the decider, was the issue of Christians. Russia had been torturing Christians in occupied Ukraine, and he found out about that issue. So, it doesn't necessarily make sense from a European perspective, but all politics is local, and you have to figure out and sort of get into the mentality of these leaders.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I agree. This is really interesting. Tobias, maybe that is the right topic for you then. If we get into the heads of European politicians and German politicians especially, my impression is that in the Baltic states especially, but also in Poland and to a certain degree also in Germany, governments are worried because they don't know exactly how to deal with Donald Trump, and also with a view to Ukraine, especially for security concerns, of course, right? So I'm curious to hear from you. What do you think Chancellor Merz is really doing differently from Chancellor Scholz, his predecessor? And do you think he has an easier or a harder job when it comes to Ukraine?
Good afternoon from Berlin, and that's not an easy question for somebody who served until a month ago in the Scholz administration, to be honest. But first of all, I can fully agree what Melinda said on the abducted children, for instance. It's the same we witnessed in Germany too, that, if war is something abstract, then public support is going down, or that there is the risk of a fatigue. If you make it concrete, if you speak about Bucha, if you speak about Irpin, if you speak about war crimes or other examples, usually you can sustain support. On Friedrich Merz, he has the chance that he's in the situation of a restart, of a reset. So that's an open game for him. I know Friedrich Merz as someone who is deeply interested in foreign policy, who likes to travel, who likes to engage with foreign leaders. I believe it's a good sign that he visited Paris. That's the obvious thing you do as a German leader, but then traveled to Warsaw and also tried to engage with Poland. So the Weimar Triangle is really, really crucial in that regard. And I would say, if you would ask me about the concerns from the Europeans, first of all, and it fits to what Angela said at the beginning. The Europeans a few weeks ago said, we want to have a place on the table. And now we witness there is not this one table. There are various channels of communication. I wouldn't even call it negotiations. There are some people speaking to others, but it's not this European idea where there is this table and the Europeans do have a seat on the table. Second, as Angela and Melinda said, for Trump, it's about getting this thing somehow solved and to get it off the table. Because the major security concern of the United States lies in the Indo-Pacific. For the Europeans, how the war in Ukraine ends is much more intertwined with their own security in three dimensions, about a deal itself. So will there be additional giveaways to the Russians, like not a de facto but a de jure acceptance of the annexation of Crimea, for instance? That would be a clear red line for the Europeans. We heard about these documents from December 21. So the revision of the NATO enlargement, for instance. The second pillar is about strengthening Ukraine. It's about resilience. Militarily, security guarantees, maybe we can elaborate on that later on, and keeping Ukraine in the European boat, in the European camp. And last but not least, it's about how to deal with Russia in the future. My major point is the Russia of the future, regardless how this war ends and when it ends, will not be a better Russia than today. So we need to be prepared as Europeans, as NATO members militarily. And just two additional thoughts on that. I'm convinced, and because Putin did it in the past, every ceasefire, every agreement about the truth will be tested by Putin immediately. So security guarantees, whatever they will be, need to be credible, because it could be a nightmare for the Europeans if you have security guarantees. They are getting tested, and they appear as not being credible. And at the same time, when the war in Ukraine ends, Russia has more than 100,000 soldiers who they can move quickly to NATO's eastern flank. I would doubt that he would attack right now. Maybe he attacks in a few years. But, we all know this in German, we have the phrase Sommerloch, so it's the black hole of the summer vacation. And imagine 100 additional Russian soldiers appear, for instance, at the Baltics and do some exercises, the debates in Europe. And last but not least, the biggest nightmare for the Europeans could be that Trump just is getting annoyed and says, okay, don't bother me any longer with Russia. That would be the nightmare for the Europeans in terms of their security.
And before we talk more about security guarantees, can I just ask you one question? So from what we heard so far, I think there's mainly two mechanisms that can be used while looking at how those negotiations are going and also trying to influence them in a way that benefits Ukraine, which is more pressure through sanctions on Russia's economy and politicians. And on the other hand, the military support for Ukraine. In those two areas, Tobias, what do you think Germany, as one of the big countries within the EU, can still do at this point? How much room is there still, and how much political willingness as well?
So first of all, on the military support, Germany has changed its constitution a few weeks ago. We do not have a debt ceiling for military expenditures like in the former days. So it's not an issue of the budget, but it's an issue of industrial capacities and our industrial capabilities. So on the one hand, I'm relaxed, because if there's a political will, we can provide additional military support to Ukraine, but we are limited by the capacities of our arms industry. On the sanctions, we all need to keep in mind that in the European Union, it's a unanimous decision. In Brussels, we have to saying, until here, and then move on. Or the German phrase would be bis hierhin und dann weiter. And I mean by that, there are many caveats, many concerns, but the European Union proves again and again that it's able to do revisions of the sanctions policy. What Germany could do is to take some of its own caveats, some of its own concerns off the table, be it on the oil price cap, or be it on the Russian shadow fleet. I believe these are the two main things we can do at the moment to put Russia under pressure. And then there's the big elephant in the room, and that's about Russian assets. If we can confiscate them and not only use the windfall profits, but the assets itself. We all know the story about the concerns of the European countries about that, and I take these concerns very serious. On the other hand, we have to admit that maybe it's the biggest card we can play against Putin at the moment.
Angela and Melinda, I'd be really curious to hear, maybe on a broader perspective, beyond Ukrainian borders, like towards Poland, towards the Baltic states. I hear a lot of concerns recently in the Baltic states that they're worried that the US might actually take out their troops, take out their intelligence, or limit their intelligence that they're sharing. And that is something that really politicians don't like to speak about in public because it would create unrest or fear. But it's something that you hear a lot about, actually. How realistic are those concerns?
So I think, again, you never know with President Trump because he says one thing, then he says another. I think those concerns are legitimate. Now, he's changed his tune a little bit on NATO. We'll see what happens in the upcoming summit. But whereas I think there really was a concern in the first Trump administration that he would withdraw the United States from NATO, that seems to have abated. And that's partly because obviously the European countries have all promised now to increase their defense spending. So first of all, and echoing what Tobias said, I mean, I think the danger of Russia moving further west at some point is very real. It's not immediate. If there were a ceasefire and an end to the war in Ukraine, it wouldn't immediately set its sights on the Baltic states. But I think it would certainly test it. And there's always been this question about how defensible the Baltic states would be in an Article 5 contingency, and we don't want to test that, but I think Putin definitely would. So far, the intelligence sharing, for instance, with Ukraine, it was from the US point of view was cut off for a few days. It's resumed again, and we don't see any indications that it will be cut off again. But I think there are a lot of questions here that people I think are correct to be concerned about.
Melinda, I recently saw this map that also showed Ukraine. I think it was a meme on some Ukrainian website or social media account, and it showed the map of Ukraine after the election in Poland. And now we have a president in Poland who is, like his predecessor, not very supportive of the, let's say, progressive policies of the prime minister. So there could be like a blocking of support for Ukraine because now, for instance, this person is not in favor of Ukraine's accession to EU. How important for Ukrainians is it to have this support in the direct neighborhood, and how important is it actually to still have this institutional possibility of EU accession, NATO accession, or could this, for instance, also be replaced for a time at least with like further economic cooperation and partnership?
So on the question you just posed to Angela, I want to jump in for just 1 second. I think she's right, but there's also a question of perception. And I think this is the key question. Is the United States still a reliable partner in Europe? And even if our actions haven't changed very much, the rhetoric has been so extreme that I think it's a new day in Europe. And you all aren't sure if you can count on us. And it does matter what Trump does, but that rhetoric has convinced a lot of people, and you see this borne out in the attitudes. That there's a sharp rise in distrust in America across the board in Europe. So I think that's worth stating. So is the EU still important to Ukraine? Absolutely. It's still the North Star. Is NATO still the North Star? No. So you see this changing in public opinion. So Ukrainians, if you ask them and speak to them privately in their heart of hearts, officially, yes. But when you speak to Ukrainians and you look at public opinion polling, they've basically given up on NATO and they're wondering, like, how long are we going to have to wait? The door's been open since 2008 and we're not getting any closer. So Ukrainians are very practical and they figured out that they have to rely on themselves. So this is the attitude that I see over and over again. And you see it in the story of the war, right? We're more than 3 years in, and they're making 30 to 40% of their own weapons, and that number is only going to increase. They made 96% of the drones that they used in Ukraine last year, that the military used. So there's a really strong attitude of self-reliance, and this is something that you see in Ukrainian history. So I expect to see more of that. And I think it really asks the question of what are we looking at for the long term for security? And there has to be some kind of security agreement. There's no security agreement in that document that Angela was talking about that the Russians have thrust at the Ukrainians. Ukrainians, which begs the question, why on earth would the Ukrainians agree to it? They never will. So, I think it's at some point we need to talk about the coalition of the willing. The Ukrainians are going to do what they have to do. They consider the armed forces of Ukraine to be the number one security deterrent in Ukraine. And I think Europeans also consider the AFU to be the number one security deterrent in Europe.
It's very true. I actually read a post by Gabrielius Landsbergis, the former Lithuanian foreign minister, and he said that actually Europeans should think about Ukraine in a way where Ukraine is Europe's security guarantee and not the other way around anymore, right? Angela and Tobias, how do you feel about what could be credible security guarantees that would actually deter Russia, not just for a while, but for good? Is there any alternative to NATO?
The usual answer would be NATO membership, Article 5, but we need to agree Putin will test. So first, Putin will test any deal. He will test any ceasefire agreement as he did with Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. So the usual answer would be NATO membership. I have understood it's more or less off the table right now, or if I understand the American position and the position of the Trump administration correctly, it's practically off the table at the moment. So it needs to be some boots, maybe not on the ground, maybe in the air, but some foreign countries, some boots in the country. And it needs to be some long-term backing, also with respect to, let's say, long-term backing for sure on military supply, but also with respect to cooperation with the Ukrainian arms industry, training and exercises, cooperation when it comes to intel and other things. That's the most crucial thing. And the best we can hope is that agreement lasts for a few years, and then Ukraine is in such a position of strength that it doesn't make sense for Putin anymore to attack a third time. That's more or less my take on that.
Yeah, I would just say I agree. Obviously, the only real security guarantee is NATO membership. But as we've all said, that seems to be off the table for the moment. The other thing is the so-called porcupine strategy, and that is to arm Ukraine to the teeth, to make sure that it's very well armed. It has now, the strongest and most competent army in Europe, and that would be a way to deter Putin or his successors to know that they would meet armed resistance even fiercer than it is now, because Ukraine has all those weapons. But that would entail an agreement between Europe and the United States to give these arms to Ukraine.
Do you think a potential role of China or India could be in a security guarantee setup?
I mean, I think China has shown, it claims to be neutral in this conflict, but it isn't. It's obviously been helping to arm Russia. We even have soldiers there. India, possibly, but neither of them have really shown very much interest in helping mediate this. I mean, the one country that's been quite active in these current negotiations is Turkey. I would say the Turks have played a much more active role. They have good relations with both countries. So that might be a better option than either China or India.
Let me jump in here too. And I think in the discussions of some kind of reassurance force or coalition of the willing, we're stuck right now, but we need it, and we need it to be inserted into Ukraine now, not when there's some kind of magic fairy peace agreement that's never going to happen. Look at Russia's behavior. It's blown through 3 demands for a real ceasefire just in this year. So I don't think we're going to get a real ceasefire. Right now, you see the UK and France saying that we'll put 5,000 to 10,000 troops on the ground. And Angela's 100% right. The Turks are saying that maybe, the Australians are saying maybe, the Swedes and the Danes are saying maybe. Poland is saying no, which I think is one of the interesting pieces, and Greece is too. Poland and Greece spend a lot. And Poland's saying no, they're worried about their own security. But the idea with this reassurance force is that you would put it in now, and it'd be a large enough that it would get Putin's attention, Right now, the Europeans don't have enough troops, and they also don't have an American backstop. I think it's a promising idea, but it definitely needs to be more than 25,000 troops. That's just a joke.
I see you nodding. Would you agree with this? And do you think that Germany would possibly play its part or a part?
You know, well, the former diplomat in me would say, don't exclude it, don't say yes, don't say no. The usual political debate in liberal society goes like, we have to decide it at the right timing, and if we don't know that kind of agreement, and so on and so forth. But Melinda, on the other hand, is right. There will not be a constant ceasefire, or there will not be the big agreement. What we can hope at the moment, to be honest, is that there is some kind of ceasefire during the negotiations, because we all know how Russians negotiate. They try to buy time at the table and try to change the reality, what we see on a daily basis, what happens in Ukraine right now with this drone attack. So I don't see the debate in Germany yet, but I honestly I wouldn't exclude it. And I fully agree, we need an American backstop. That's the most pressing and most important issue, that there is some kind of backstop mechanism, because otherwise it will not work out. And I have, at least at the moment, I doubt that Trump will give this backstop guarantee, but we'll never know.
Yeah, I would personally agree. Could you tell us also a bit about the current debate, especially I think for the listeners in the US, this would be very interesting, about the current debate in Germany about conscription and the reintroducing of conscription, and how that is currently portrayed, for instance, also in the media, in politics. What's your feeling of how German society views this topic?
So first of all, maybe let's start with the biggest misunderstanding in Germany, why we are debating this. Because the misunderstanding is we are not doing it for Mr. Trump. If we take the debates within, so we are doing it for ourselves and for our allies, and we would have a similar debate even under President Harris, to be very blunt. Because if we take the debates inside NATO very seriously, if we take it's serious what we have already agreed to in terms of the capability planning goals, what we should provide, it is crystal clear that first of all, on the spending side, it needs to be at least 3.5% plus something with collateral use with respect to infrastructure and other things, and that adds up to 5% in the end. Second, it's on the personnel. It's on the women and men on the ground. Boris Pistorius, the German Minister of Defense, made it public last week. We need to have at least 60,000 additional soldiers on a permanent basis for the German armed forces. And we need to have a better equipped and better trained reserve. For almost 2 to 3 decades, we didn't take care about the reserve in terms of the data, of training, okay, how do we contact people in the reserve, and therefore we are having a debate: should we reintroduce conscription again? And I would predict, and ignore please for a moment that I'm a member of the Green Party. That's my very personal opinion. I would predict we will come to some kind of conscription again. Not the old model of the 80s. Not like every young male gets a postcard and needs to show up. It will be more or less, I would predict, like a Swedish model, where you say, okay, young people, they need to show up. There is a medical assessment if they are able to serve. And they are equipped with information, what they can do within the armed forces. And if enough people if enough people come voluntarily to the armed forces, then we are fine. But we need to have the option then to select a certain amount of young people to serve for 1 year or some months in the armed forces. So it will not be the old model, like you have thousands, tens of thousands every year who are going under conscription. It will be more selective, more really fitting to the purpose. But I wouldn't be surprised, let's say in 2 or 4 years, that it will not be a solely voluntarily model. It will be some aspects which are mandatory in the end.
Thank you for sharing. And just a quick note to our listeners, if you want, you can ask questions. You can either post them in the chat. I think you would have to post them in the chat or in the Q&A section. I'm not sure if you can just unmute yourself in this digital setup. So please, if you have any questions, do let us know, and we're happy to answer whatever you come up with. In the meantime, Angela, what do you think is America's view, or the US administration, let's put it this way, like the US administration's view towards those debates about 5% of NATO spending, the upcoming The Hague summit? Of course, many European countries are now really pushing ahead to show to the US how willing they are to actually take security in their own hands. But is it credible from the outside? Because if you look at some of those national debates, you can see that there's also a lot of, let's say, creative accounting and numbers shifting. And is the US administration impressed with Europe?
Well, I think it has made an impression on the Trump administration. I mean, also the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has said, you can say 3.5% actually on defense and then another 1.5% on infrastructure, things that help sustain the military. I think the Trump administration's admonitions have had an impact. Most of the European members of NATO have agreed to increase their defense spending. Some are going even above 5%. I do not believe that the US currently spends 5% of its GDP on defense itself. So I think that's had an impact. And again, we'll see. I mean, I think the point of the upcoming NATO summit is going to be to show that Europe understands it has to bear more of the burden. And that's why I think you've heard much less recently from the Trump administration about sort of pulling back from Europe, questioning NATO itself. And so I think that, I think we'll see that again at this upcoming NATO summit. That's definitely had an impact. And I think European countries have woken up to the fact that if they don't do that, there is a danger of this American administration essentially leaving Europe. I think it probably will be pulling troops out. This question was raised before from some countries. We'll see what happens. But I think, I think that's been one, probably positive result of all of the rhetoric and the threats we've heard from the administration, that European countries are taking their security more seriously and their defense spending more seriously. And of course, what Russia is doing has helped impress on them that they have to.
It seems like a lot of things that the Europeans can do by themselves. When we look at negotiations, or how Tobias put it, like the different channels of communication that are being used in parallel, like what role can the EU actually play at this negotiation table if we use this figure of speech? Is there room for them, or are they just not, or maybe they're just not using it, or we don't know about it?
Are you asking me that, or
yeah, I'm actually asking you, but also if like somebody else wants to answer this, whoever feels like answering.
The Trump administration has largely excluded, obviously, Europe from playing an active role in these negotiations. But as it becomes less clear that there's going to be any success here, I think they may be more open to understanding that the Europeans really do have a role to play here. But obviously, what we've seen so far in the direct negotiations is that there's been a US presence some of the time, but there hasn't been an acceptance that the EU or as a body or even individual countries should be present at these negotiations.
So if I may add, I believe, in the end, you need the Europeans, and I wouldn't say EU, but you need the Europeans for the implementation of any deal, if there would be a deal in the end. Especially if Trump when Trump does not want to send his own troops to Ukraine for security guarantees, he needs somebody else. And I would predict, with all my due respect, Chinese, Indian, Turkish troops alone, they can't do it. You need some Europeans on the ground. You need some Europeans getting involved. And on the long-term guarantees for Ukraine, it's not only about the military side, it's also about the economic side. So you need the EU as the main anchor for Ukraine, hopefully Ukraine as an EU member one day, where they can strengthen their resilience also in economic and societal terms. And that's the role of the Europeans. And last but not least, I see the biggest role at the moment for the E3, for UK, France, Germany. They are closely coordinating. Remember the trip to Kiev. So it's also a coalition of the willing from the European side. They are forming to coordinate with the Americans.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Please.
Well,
Yeah.
two other little tiny points. So even though this new administration in the US doesn't love multilateralism, to put it very charitably, we are going to need multilateral institutions as we get closer to a real peace negotiation. And the OSCE is probably the only body that will be able to patrol the front line and be watching for violations. So I think that the Trump administration will discover the OSCE. And then on the other point, I think as we get closer to negotiations, it's interesting to see which country, everyone wants to be in charge. Everyone wants to claim that they're the ones that brought Russia and Ukraine together. So we see the Turks trying this, we see the Qataris, and we see the Saudis, and maybe the Chinese. So everyone wants a piece in this, and everyone wants the Nobel Prize. So I don't know that it will be the EU, but it could be an actor that we don't expect.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see the danger, on the other hand, that the EU could also risk to alienate Ukraine in a way? Because after the coalition of the willing meeting, or after this trip to Kiev by the three heads of state, it seemed like, well, there were a lot of threats made towards Russia. Well, if you don't accept the ceasefire that Ukraine proposed, there will be very heavy sanctions. We will not accept this. And nothing really much followed, because then the 17th EU sanctions package that followed was just more of the same. And now we have the 18th package that was agreed on today, at least in the first step, which also doesn't carry much more weight. So how much can the EU actually afford to not do enough, so to speak, before alienating Ukraine?
So right now, I think Angela wants to say something. I'm going to say two sentences. Right now, they can't stand us. So I think Europe is in fine form. But when you start to drill down, there's greater appreciation for different actors. So the Nordic countries are very well respected. The UK and France are very well respected. But you're right. If the EU can't do something further, it may discredit itself. But right now, I would say the anger is directed at Washington, D.C. and our inability to put another assistance package through. There's various things that they're upset about, but U.S. assistance to Ukraine was a bipartisan effort for 30 years. And this isn't the first time that Ukraine assistance has become a political football in a Trump administration. So I think it feels like a real betrayal.
I mean, the problem with the EU, obviously, is it's divided over this. About how to help Ukraine. I found it very interesting that Prime Minister Orban, I think yesterday, suddenly said, that Russia is really a threat, and you have to meet it militarily. I'm not quite sure why he changed his story there, but still, I mean, he has been obviously one of the major figures against renewing assistance for Ukraine, and also allowing Ukraine to join the European Union, although that's much further off. So I think in a way, it's the individual European countries, as Melinda said, that are very important, particularly the Nordic and Baltic states now.
Angela, that's exactly my point. We should speak rather of consequences than instead of sanctions as Europeans, because we all know sanctions as EU, you need unanimity among the EU 27. It's a long bureaucratic process. The slowest defines the speed of the process. But what we can do also as Germans, as large European economies, make clear to Putin that if he does not accept a ceasefire, we will extend and increase our military support for Ukraine also in the long run. That can be done on a bilateral national basis in the end.
Mhm.
Your
Yeah.
long-range missiles would also get his attention.
Yeah.
I think we're all in Washington hoping and waiting for your new government to maybe not do it or do it, and then for them to show up and for military commentators to announce what happened.
It's a thought I often have, yeah.
I would like to add that I think Chancellor Merz did a masterful job of navigating his Oval Office meeting with President Trump. Apparently, he had studied previous meetings that hadn't gone so well, but I think he set the right tone, but he also made quite clear to President Trump what the stakes are here, who is responsible for this war, and what has to be done going forward.
We have one question. So last reminder, this is your last chance to ask a question to the panel. In how far do you think what is going on in the US right now in California and nationally could interfere with even thinking about the war of Russia against Ukraine? So who would be the best link to make sure the US is not forgetting about the war in Europe? It's a tricky one.
It is a tricky one. I mean, obviously what's going on in Los Angeles and the whole migrant question is what preoccupies the administration and the American public too. It's also, for the people who voted for Trump, this is probably their number one issue. And he wants to be able to show that he has successes. And as you said at the beginning, at the moment, from the point of view of the US trying to end the war, that hasn't been successful. Obviously, policy toward the Middle East hasn't been very successful. And so this certainly is something I think where you're going to see the focus and would indicate that there'll be even less focus at the moment on what's happening in Ukraine and on the Russia-Ukraine war.
I hate to sound like a broken record, but the issue of children is the one that will make this salient again. And I was really heartened that the German chancellor spoke about it with President Trump. But you're right. It's really hard to explain also to foreign audiences how different this administration is. They view Budapest as sort of the center of Europe now. The way that traditional foreign policy elites would look at Europe is completely changed. The people that they admire in Europe are totally different. So, and those guys are not going to be very helpful in making the case for Ukraine in additional assistance. But I think it's these sort of wedge emotional issues on the outskirt, and also General Kellogg. General Kellogg is in the room. He knows the issues and he keeps pushing it. So I hope that there's more people around President Trump that feel similarly that we just don't know about yet.
Last but not least, don't forget to speak to the Hill. You know, many senators and congressmen and women are traveling around. Senator Graham was in Berlin. Speak to them, explain to them their policies, speak to the right people who have the ear of the president. That would be my recommendation.
Mm-hmm. One last question, and as we started a bit late, I would suggest that we will deal with this question before we round it up. Could economic interest be a potential catalyst for change of interest for Russia, like, for example, Nord Stream reactivating again? Any thoughts on that? I have my own, but I would like to give you the floor.
Honestly, I doubt because we have a very, German, or let's say Western European understanding what a treaty or a contract is. For many Germans, if you reach a deal, if you conclude a peace deal, it's the end point of some negotiations. Not for the Russians. It's a new focal point, a new level playing field from which they start and will continue. And therefore, economic interest like Nord Stream for the Russians, it would be the biggest gift to increase the dependency of European economies from Russia. It would clearly bring them to a better position.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Tobias. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Melinda. Thank you, Tobias. It was a pleasure to speak to you. I learned a lot, and I hope our audience did too. And despite the very serious topic of this conversation, I'm very glad that we have this format for dialogue, for speaking to each other, for asking questions. And I hope everybody who listened in will take this home or to work and start maybe some of their own additional research or additional work on this topic. So thank you very much. And this is it. So
Thank you,
see
everybody.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.